Hello everyone, my name's Nigel North and you may know me as a lute player, and this is my 13-course Baroque lute. Regarding what we're going to chat about today, I also played the violin as a kid and classical and electric guitar, and so all of those different worlds have added to how I can approach music, particularly in the ideas of how to phrase and how to articulate. Today's talk with some music is called Common Ground, and it's come about that for the last few decades I've had the pleasure of visiting guitar festivals and doing masterclasses with guitarists, and I often found myself describing what we do on the lute next to what we do on the guitar as being almost the same, and sometimes we don't hear the differences. And I came up with an image myself of there being two planets, and you can look at them both in the sky. They look exactly the same from here. Let's say they're both the world, and then if we approach one and then the other, we see little differences, like the color of the sea may be different, the height of the trees, and so on. And when I've worked with wonderful guitar players, it's more a question of just noticing the differences. And you can choose how you want to play, of course. But those of us sort of in what's called today the historically informed world, we work with copies of original instruments. We've read various books, which are not so many for the lute, about how to play, what the approach was. And that's what I'd like to share. What's the fundamental difference about being on the lute planet as opposed to being on the guitar planet, but they're both musical. The first thing, the subject that always used to frighten me because I didn't actually understand it, was rhetoric. Bruce Haynes, in his book called The End of Early Music, says we should throw away early music as a term and just use rhetorical music. But rhetoric is such an important part of how we make music and how they made music in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. And I'd like to start by just taking a little time to explain what that was. These days, sadly, we think of rhetoric in bad terms, politicians and lawyers. But there's something of the essence there. In fact, that's how it started. So rhetoric goes back to the classical Greek and Roman times, and people were trained to be a good public speaker, to be an orator. And they had to do several things. They had to write their speech. They had to think of the subject first, write it, put it together in an order where they knew they would persuade the audience that they were right. It had to sound eloquent and beautiful. They weren't allowed to talk about bad things. And then they had to memorize it. And then when it came to the day, the performance, they did it from memory. Now, that was the ancient art of oratory, and in the Renaissance, it was sort of dug up, rethought, and it was attached to music. And so many books about music say there's nothing like it. If you make music without being an orator, it's nothing. And it was the model behind everything. Now, with the lute, we have, like the guitar, so our one common thing between the two was is we pluck a note and it dies immediately. So we can't sustain. But the sound, one or two books say that the sound of the lute is very much, of all instruments, like speaking. So the whole idea of rhetoric is that we want to speak on our instruments rather than sing or shout. We can certainly dance, but it's going to have an element of speaking. And then it goes on. So the very last beat I played is a very easy to hear example of a French ending. When we can hear that and see the violin original, we can see the theme that goes throughout the movement. And it's not a fugue, but again, relating it to rhetoric, when you had a speech, you had to choose a subject and you had to discuss it. So this largo is a bit of that, really. And articulation, the first three notes in the violin are all slurred. Now on the lute, we're in the lute planet. We're lucky that we can slur with the left hand and it makes three sounds that do go together. They're loud enough. If on the guitar, the difference between the first note and the other two is so strong, you can pluck it and try and imitate a left hand slurred. You can make a diminuendo, because that's what's in the violin. It also puts those three notes together, and it goes to these lovely pairs, and they go together. On the lute and the guitar, we can stop two notes on two different strings, make it sound like a bowed, slurred pair, because the good note at the beginning rings on over the second note, and then they have a harmonic quality to them as well. So we get to what would be called a 7/6 with an extra note, and then we have a silence. Then we have the same again, but in a different, actually upside down. And when it gets to the second time of it, we get this trill, a very normal trill, and you can see in the violin it's got T on it. Then the third time, with a little introduction, three notes, pairs. I would say that's almost a French ending, that it's a C major chord with a B flat in the bass, a 6/4-2. That's the appoggiatura, that's the real note, that's the appoggiatura, that's the real note. And you can see in the violin that's all, it looks like it could be four notes. So the way the lute, we can be educated by violin music and see if we can copy what it would sound like on the violin, because we don't get as much instruction for articulation. But the music of Sylvius Weiss, the contemporary of Bach, has lots of left-hand slurs. I would always recommend to guitarists and even lute players that if you have to slur something, it's not a cop-out. You're not doing it because you can't play it quickly. You're doing it to be expressive. A slur, stronger, weaker. And you can sigh, you can snap, you can make it quite a varied expression. So from bar 3 again, that I think of as a C major 7th chord, and then you see that you can have a big diminuendo to make the phrase end.